You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, Donald Trump finally took the stand today in the New York Attorney General trial. Now, first off, I want to draw your attention to your MSNBC colleague Andrew Weissman's tweet. Breaking, AG gets Trump to agree that the financial statements and Trump's personal guarantee were to induce banks to lend money, key fact for this fraud case. Now, why is this especially significant?
It's an important admission by Donald Trump, but saying that, well, yes, the financial statements we provided to the banks seeking loans induced them to give us those loans. That's a little bit like admitting that water is wet and fire is hot. He really didn't need to admit that. It was so obvious, but I think he would have looked especially foolish if he said, yes, we prepared these financial statements and made personal guarantees and submitted them to the bank, expecting that the bank would not look at them, would not rely on them at all. That would be a foolish answer to give. And as foolish as Donald Trump was willing to look today in court, I guess he wasn't willing to look quite that foolish. So, yes, it's an important admission, but it's not one that, in my opinion, Judge Engoron needed to, continue to find against Donald Trump. He has already found against Donald Trump on the liability question. In other words, the judge has already concluded that Trump and his adult sons engaged in massive, systemic, years-long business fraud. And now the questions that remain to be answered are, how much will he be fined? How much will he have to pay back? The technical term is, how much will he have to disgorge? And should he and his sons be barred from doing business in New York moving forward? Those are the open questions that Judge Engoron is attempting to answer, during the course of this trial.
Now, during the course of this trial, to that point, there were a lot of contentious moments between Judge Engoron and Donald Trump, who reportedly wouldn't answer any of the questions directly while he was going on, his usual freewheeling tirades. So what do you think Trump's goal was here? Because generally, defendants don't try to instigate or infuriate the people who have unilateral decision-making power over their money damages.
Trump's goal is to illegitimize the very system, the process, the institutions that are seeking to hold him accountable for his wrongdoing, for his fraud, ultimately, in other cases, for his crimes. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but let me just give you a sampling, Brian, of some of what Donald Trump said today in that New York courtroom. He complained that the judge called him a fraud or found that he was a fraud. He called Attorney James, quote, a political hack. This is in his sworn testimony in that courtroom. He was asked a question about his property values, and in non-responsive form, he veered off into how he protected the United States from China and Russia, not exactly responsive to the question. At one point, Judge Engoron became so frustrated with him, he said to Trump's lawyers, quote, I beseech you to control your client. The judge then said, look, you, Donald Trump, can attack me all you want, just answer the questions. And then finally, when Kevin Wallace, one of Attorney General James' lawyers, was asking Donald Trump a question, Trump said, quote, you and every other Democrat coming after me from 15 different sides, you're all haters. This is not the kind of testimony we ordinarily see from a defendant. Donald Trump's goal here, Brian, is basically to try to illegitimize the system. Think about it. If he were to answer in a responsive fashion, if he were to follow all of the rules and procedures and protocols of this fraud trial, what would that do? It would sort of concede the legitimacy of the very proceeding that is seeking to hold Donald Trump accountable for his wrongdoing. That's why he is full of bluff and bluster and BS, and he wants to turn the whole thing into a circus, into a mockery, because he will then argue, you see that whole system and the outcome it produced, you can't rely on it. So, that is why defendants, and I've had this happen before, I've had defendants in a RICO case take the stand and literally start yelling and screaming things that they wanted the jury to hear, even though those things were not responsive to the questions being asked. You know what that indicates? That indicates weakness, not strength, right? It indicates that you cannot win this case based on the facts. So you're going to distract, engage in histrionics, and then claim that the outcome that will hold you accountable was illegitimate.
And by the way, this is a recurring theme for him. I mean, he did the same thing in the lead up to the 2020 election, where he did everything he could to undermine the election results before they even happened. I mean, he came out before all the votes had even been cast, and he said that he won the election. And at the same time, he said he won the election, and also that none of the election results are valid. And he just went on and on with that whole same thing. So, I guess in the case of Donald Trump, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah, and following up on that, there is an often used saying in the law when it comes to, how you approach defending yourself at a trial. And it goes something like, when you have the facts on your side, pound on the facts. When you have the law on your side, pound on the law. When you have neither on your side, pound on the table, make some noise, distract. All we saw from Donald Trump today was a whole bunch of table pounding.
Now, was there anything else that stuck out at you from this trial as Donald Trump's testimony was completed here?
Donald Trump made some other minor admissions. He actually did concede that, yes, some of the values may have been a little high, some of the values may have been a little low. Of course, he attributed that to mistakes. He talked about how he relied on accountants.
Funny how the mistakes only ever go in one direction.
Yeah, yeah. So, but I really do think that Donald Trump understands he has no defense, not on the facts, and he's going to lose this case. So, I think what he's doing is, one, continuing to play to his base, calling the judge names, demonizing the prosecutor, and he hopes that at the end of the day, that the voters will reinstall him in the White House so he can start to do things like kill any pending criminal cases against him, pardon himself and anybody else he believes should be pardoned. And based on some new reporting, he also has a pretty well-populated enemies list, and he's making no secrets about the fact that he is looking to populate his administration, in the horrific instance he's reelected, with the kind of sycophants who will go about prosecuting Donald Trump's enemies even though they have committed no crime. So, I know we always say the upcoming election is the most important election in history. I think this time that is probably accurate.
Yeah, I think that was perfectly put. If this civil trial does show that he committed tax fraud, then will that have any implications for the IRS for some type of federal tax fraud case? I mean, meaning yet another case at the hands of Jack Smith and the DOJ?
Yeah, what's one more prosecution of Donald Trump for his crimes? It's a great point, though, because anytime you engage in tax fraud, you basically, of necessity, violate federal tax laws and you violate state tax laws. It's not like you're going to fully pay your state taxes that you owe, but defraud the government on those same tax forms that you submit for that tax year.
Right.
So it looks like, based on the evidence that is coming out during the course of the trial, that Donald Trump probably has some tax liability for the fraud that he perpetrated in New York to the New York City state taxpayers and the New York State taxpayers. So of necessity, he probably also has tax liability federally and perhaps committed crimes in relation to the federal tax laws. The question becomes, will the federal government do anything about it? We know that because he's running for president and Joe Biden is his opponent, Merrick Garland has basically opted out of doing anything against Donald Trump, passed it all off to Jack Smith. Will Jack Smith have the time, the inclination, the staff to also dig into a possible tax prosecution against Donald Trump when he is already prosecuting Donald Trump for trying to criminally overturn the results of a presidential election and committing crimes like documents, mishandling of documents, obstruction of justice, and violation of our nation's espionage laws down in Florida? Is he really going to undertake a tax investigation and prosecution because some of that evidence has now been revealed in this New York fraud case? I would probably bet against that.
Well, do the outcomes or the conviction, whether or not there's a conviction in any of these other cases, will that play into whether Jack Smith would make a decision to bring forward another case? Like, for example, if Donald Trump is convicted in the Washington, D.C. trial, and then if he's convicted down in Florida, and he has basically what would be a de facto life in prison sentence by virtue of his age, would that then dissuade Jack Smith from bringing forward another prosecution that would just basically add another lifetime to a guy who's already going to be in prison for the rest of his life?
Yeah, based on my experience as a career prosecutor, I think I can answer that question almost definitively, not for Jack Smith, but for myself. The answer is yes. You can only confine a man for but one life. And I had so many similar circumstances where, especially when I was chief of homicide at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia, we would have defendants who had 3, 4, 5 bodies to their credit. You know, my experience is once young men, generally our murder defendants were men, not women. Once a young man pulls a trigger once and takes somebody's life, what we found is that, you know, the inhibition was reduced and they would pull the trigger again and again. And we would find many defendants with multiple bodies to their credit. What we often did, Brian, unless we could bring all the murders together in one prosecution because they were legally related to one another or related to one another in a legally significant fashion, we would go with the strongest case first. If we won a conviction, the penalty in DC for a first-degree murder conviction is a mandatory minimum 30 years and up to life. And you can only confine a man for but one lifetime. So what would be the upside of prosecuting case after case after case against somebody who is serving, as you say, a de facto life sentence? The only consideration there, and excuse this old homicide prosecutor for sort of belaboring this point, the only consideration there is there are additional victims out there. In murder cases, you have family members who lost a loved one to violent crime. If there are surviving victims whose cases you are deciding not to pursue because the perpetrator is already serving what is, in essence, a life term, you had to make sure you coordinated with those victims because their rights needed to be vindicated as well. Long-winded answer to the question. I can't imagine when Jack Smith wins a conviction in DC, and he will, because the evidence, the admissible evidence of Donald Trump's guilt is overwhelming. And when he convicts Donald Trump down in Florida, which may take a little longer, given that that case is being presided over by Judge Aileen Cannon, I can't imagine there will be more criminal cases brought against Donald Trump because he will live out the rest of his life in the Federal Bureau of Prisons at that point.
Well, from your lips to God's ears. So with that said, obviously a lot to stay on top of here. So for anybody watching, if you want to stay on top of these trials as they continue to play out, make sure to subscribe. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.